It was -10 degrees Celsius on Christmas Eve. My father locked me outside in the snow for mouthing off to him at dinner. I watched them unwrap gifts through the window, and just 1 hour later a black limousine slowly rolled up. My billionaire grandmother stepped out, saw me shivering, glanced at the house, and uttered one word: demolish. That night, my family threw me out in the freezing cold on Christmas Eve. My own mother watched, then closed the curtains, leaving me to face a night that could have ended my life. The air bit into my lungs, sharp and painful, as I stood barefoot on the snow-covered porch. It was -10 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that could steal your life in minutes, and all I had was jeans and a thin sweater. My father, David, had just shoved me out the back door, sending me tumbling into the snow, and now every entrance was locked. I could hear their laughter from inside, the warm glow of the Christmas tree mocking me through the window. My crime? Correcting David at dinner. He'd been lecturing my younger sister, Chloe, that women weren't built for engineering, that math was beyond us. I'd calmly, quietly, pointed out that studies show no cognitive difference in mathematical ability between genders. That the representation gap was social, not biological. David's face had gone crimson. My mother, Sarah, just stared at her plate. Chloe shrank in her seat. Then, David grabbed me. He dragged me through the kitchen, past the festive decorations, and threw me out into the dark, freezing night like I was nothing. Through the living room window, I could see the tree, hundreds of white lights glittering. Presents piled beneath it like a small mountain. My family sat around it, warm and comfortable, as if nothing had happened. David was laughing, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Sarah arranged cookies, while Chloe huddled on the couch with a blanket, probably relieved that for once, she wasn't the target. I knocked on the window. Sarah looked up, met my eyes, and then, deliberately, turned away. She said something to David, who glanced at me with cold satisfaction before drawing the curtains closed. That was the moment something shattered inside me. Parents are supposed to protect their children from harm. Mine had become the source of it. And my mother, the woman who should have loved me unconditionally, had chosen her comfort over my survival. I need to explain something about my childhood, or you might think that Christmas Eve was just a terrible fluke. An isolated incident in an otherwise normal family. It wasn't. That night was simply the brutal, logical conclusion of 15 years of escalating cruelty. David had always been a volatile, controlling man, obsessed with respect and absolute obedience. When I was very young, maybe 4 or 5, I remember thinking all fathers were like him. The explosive anger over minor infractions, the long silences that felt like storms gathering on the horizon. Everyone in our house learned to read his moods, to adjust their behavior accordingly. Sarah had perfected the art of appeasement, always smoothing things over, making excuses, always finding ways to blame everyone but her husband for his outbursts. "Your father works very hard," she'd tell Chloe and me when we complained. "He has a lot of stress. We need to be understanding." Understanding meant never disagreeing. It meant laughing at his jokes, even when they were cruel. It meant accepting his criticism as gospel, no matter how unfair. Understanding meant shrinking ourselves down to nothing so his ego could fill every corner of the room. My first clear memory of his volatile nature happened when I was 7. I'd gotten a B+ on a spelling test instead of an A. David had helped me study, and he took my grade as a personal insult. He snatched the paper from my hands, tore it to pieces, and threw them in my face, screaming that I was stupid, ungrateful, and determined to embarrass him. When I started crying, he grabbed my arms so hard it left fingerprint bruises that lasted 2 weeks. Sarah's response? She bought me a long-sleeved shirt to cover the marks and told me to try harder next time. That became the pattern. David would explode. Something would break, either an object or a piece of my spirit. Sarah would clean up the mess, literally and figuratively, and life would continue as if nothing had happened. There were no consequences for his behavior, only for mine. I quickly learned that my safety depended on my invisibility. The less attention I attracted, the fewer opportunities he had to find fault. Chloe was born when I was 6, and from the moment she came home, I knew protecting her was my responsibility. David seemed less interested in her. She was quieter, more compliant, better at reading his moods and disappearing when necessary. But I still positioned myself between them whenever I sensed danger. I became an expert at drawing his fire, making myself the target so Chloe could escape unscathed. By middle school, teachers saw me as a difficult student. Not because I misbehaved, but because I flinched when an adult raised their voice. I struggled to make friends, unsure how to interact with people who weren't constantly evaluating me for signs of disobedience. I was hypervigilant, anxious, and convinced I was fundamentally broken, somehow deserving the mistreatment I received at home. One teacher, Ms. Evelyn Carter, noticed a bruise on my collarbone during gym class when I was 12. She pulled me aside, asking gentle questions, but I fed her the lies I'd been trained to tell, fell down the stairs, walked into a door, clumsy, so clumsy, always hurting myself. She didn't believe me. I saw it in her eyes. But without my cooperation, what could she do? She reported her concerns anyway, and a social worker came to our house. David was charming. Warm, attentive, self-deprecating about his worries for his daughter's futures. Sarah served homemade cookies and talked about our close family. Chloe and I sat on the couch like props in a play, nodding at all the right moments. The social worker left satisfied. That night, David punished me violently with his belt for telling lies about our family. The social worker's visit had been triggered by Ms. Carter's report, and somehow David had figured out the connection. He was terrifyingly clever that way. I stopped talking to teachers after that. I stopped talking to anyone who might try to help. The lesson had been delivered with brutal clarity, reaching out only made things worse. The system meant to protect children like me was no match for a man who could wear a mask so convincingly. High school should have been an escape. A bigger building, more teachers, endless opportunities to blend in. Instead, it became another arena poisoned by David's influence. He insisted on reviewing my homework nightly, not to help, but to criticize. He demanded access to my school email and social media. He interrogated me about every classmate interaction, convinced I was somehow sullying the family's reputation. The Christmas Eve dinner that led to my exile had been brewing for weeks. David was fixated on Chloe's future, specifically his insistence that she focus on domestic skills, not the math and science she excelled at. Every night at dinner, he'd lecture about proper roles for women, the foolishness of fighting nature, the inevitable failure awaiting girls who dared to compete in male-dominated fields. Chloe was only 9, but she was brilliant. Her teachers already recognized her as gifted, especially in math. She talked about being an astronaut or a scientist, the way children do when the world still feels full of infinite possibility. David seemed determined to crush that spark. I'd bitten my tongue through most of it. Years of survival taught me when to stay silent. But that night, something shifted. Maybe it was Chloe's shoulders slumping lower with each pronouncement. Maybe it was the soft Christmas music, a cruel counterpoint to the ugliness unfolding at our table. Or maybe, I was just tired of being afraid. When David declared that women lacked the neurological capacity for advanced mathematics, the words spilled out before I could stop them. That's actually not supported by scientific evidence. Multiple studies show mathematical ability isn't gender-determined. The gap in representation comes from social factors, not cognitive ones. Chloe can be whatever she wants to be. The silence lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. I counted them, my heart pounding so hard I felt it in my ears. David's face went through a fascinating transformation, surprise first, because I rarely spoke back, then disbelief, as if he couldn't process that his oldest daughter had dared to contradict him. Finally, rage. Pure, incandescent rage that twisted his features into something barely human. What did you just say to me? Every instinct I'd developed over 15 years screamed at me to apologize, to backtrack, to beg for forgiveness. Instead, I lifted my chin and met his eyes. I said, "The research doesn't support what you're claiming." Chloe is 9 years old. Let her dream. He was out of his chair before I could react. His hand closed around my upper arm with crushing force, and he dragged me away from the table so violently that my hips slammed into the corner of the buffet. Sarah made a small sound of protest that died before it fully formed. Chloe pressed herself back in her chair, tears already streaming down her face. David hauled me through the kitchen, past the mudroom, and shoved me out the back door with enough force to send me tumbling down the concrete steps. The cold hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. By the time I scrambled to my feet, the door was locked. "You can come back in when you've learned to show some respect," he shouted through the door. "Maybe a little cold will cool down that smart mouth of yours." I stood there, stunned, as the reality of my situation sank in. -10 degrees. No coat, no shoes, no phone. The snow was already seeping through my socks, the wind cutting through my thin sweater like it wasn't even there. I huddled against the side of the house, trying to preserve what little body heat I had. My teeth chattered so violently I thought they might crack. My ears burned with pain, my feet numb inside soaked socks. I started to shake uncontrollably, my body's desperate attempt to generate warmth. I thought about the neighbors. The family on our left was away. The elderly couple on our right went to bed at 7. I considered walking to a gas station or store, but the nearest was over a mile away. I wasn't sure I could make it without shoes. I thought about dying, about how stupid and senseless it would be to freeze to death on Christmas Eve because my father couldn't handle being corrected by a teenage girl. That's when I saw the headlights. A black limousine, sleek and long, turned onto our quiet suburban street. It looked completely out of place among the modest two-story houses. The car glided to a stop directly in front of our house, and the driver's door opened. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out and opened the rear passenger door. The woman who emerged was in her early 70s, but she moved with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding rooms. She wore a full-length fur coat, black leather gloves, her silver hair swept back elegantly. Her eyes, even in the dim lamplight, were the exact same shade of hazel as mine. Grandma Vivian. My father's mother, whom I hadn't seen since I was 9 years old. The woman David refused to discuss. The woman whose name made my mother's lips press into a thin line. The woman who had been erased from our family like she'd never existed. She took 3 steps toward the house before she noticed me, pressed against the siding, shaking uncontrollably. For a long moment, she simply stared. Her gaze traveled from my sock-covered feet, to my inadequate sweater, to my lips, which I'm sure were blue by then. "Ma'am," the chauffeur said, but Grandma Vivian held up a gloved hand without looking at him. She walked toward me slowly, her heels crunching in the snow. When she reached me, she didn't ask what happened. She didn't demand explanations. She simply removed her coat and wrapped it around my shoulders. The warmth was so sudden, so profound, that I nearly collapsed. "How long?" Her voice was steady, controlled. "I don't know." 20 minutes, maybe 30, I managed through chattering teeth. It had felt like an eternity. Something shifted in her expression. Not rage, exactly. Something colder than the air around us. Something calculated and final. She turned to look at the house. The curtains were still drawn, but I could see shadows moving behind them. My family, warm and comfortable, celebrating without me, probably not even wondering if I was still alive. Grandma Vivian studied the house. The 2-story colonial where David had brought Sarah as a young bride. The house where Chloe and I had grown up. The house that never felt like home, because love in that building was conditional, rationed, and could be revoked at any moment for the smallest perceived slight. She spoke a single word. Demolish. I didn't understand what she meant until much later. In that moment, all I knew was that she guided me to the limousine, where the heater was running full blast. The chauffeur, whose name I would learn was Garrett, had already produced a thick blanket and a thermos of hot tea. Grandma Vivian sat beside me, watching my color slowly return, saying nothing. After about 20 minutes, when I could finally speak without my voice shaking, she asked me to tell her everything. So, I did. 6 years of stories poured out of me. The cruel remarks David specialized in. The comments about my weight, my intelligence, my worth. The way Sarah enabled it all with her silence and selective blindness. The times Chloe had been spared because I'd deliberately drawn David's ire. The isolation, the walking on eggshells, the constant fear of setting him off. Grandma Vivian listened, without interrupting. When I finished, she reached over and took my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I should have come sooner, she said. I should have fought harder. He's my son, and I failed to raise him into a decent man, but I will not fail you. The story of why Grandma Vivian had been cut out of our lives, I learned over the following weeks. When I was 9, she had confronted David about his mistreatment of me after witnessing him berate me for an entire afternoon over a spilled glass of milk. She had threatened to report him to social services if he didn't get help for his anger issues. David's response had been to ban her from our lives entirely. He told Chloe and me that Grandma Vivian had died, then moved us to a different state to ensure she couldn't find us. What he didn't know was that Grandma Vivian had spent the last 6 years searching. She'd hired private investigators, followed every lead, and never gave up. The move that was supposed to hide us had only delayed her. She'd finally tracked us down 3 weeks before Christmas, and had planned to simply show up and demand access to her grandchildren. Finding me freezing on the lawn had changed her approach significantly. That night, Grandma Vivian took me to her hotel suite. A doctor was summoned to check my extremities for frostbite. My ears had superficial frostnip that would heal within days, and 2 of my toes showed early signs of frostbite that required careful warming and monitoring, but would recover fully. The doctor said I was lucky. Another 20 minutes in those conditions, and the damage could have been permanent. I soaked in a hot bath for an hour while Grandma Vivian made phone calls in the next room. I couldn't hear everything, but phrases like emergency custody, reckless exposure to danger, and criminal charges drifted through the door. The next morning, Christmas Day, I woke up in the most comfortable bed I'd ever experienced. Sun streamed through the windows of the penthouse suite. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed everything. Then I saw Grandma Vivian sitting in a chair by the window, impeccably dressed, watching me with those sharp hazel eyes. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," she said. "We have a big day ahead of us." What followed was a masterclass in what money and determination could accomplish. Grandma Vivian, I learned, wasn't just wealthy. She was the founder and former CEO of Preston Wright Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate worth billions. She had stepped back from daily operations 6 years ago but remained the majority shareholder and chairwoman of the board. Her net worth, according to financial magazines, hovered around $4 billion. David, her only child, had been cut off financially at 25 after she discovered he'd been embezzling from a trust fund she'd set up for him. He responded by marrying Sarah, whose family had modest money, and building a middle-class life fueled by resentment and bitterness. Every cruel word he'd ever spoken to me, I realized, was really directed at his mother. I was just a convenient target who couldn't fight back. On Christmas morning, while my family was presumably opening presents and perhaps not wondering where I was, Grandma Vivian's legal team was filing emergency motions. Her personal attorney, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, who had apparently never lost a case, arrived with a team of associates. Photographs were taken of my frostbite injuries. My statement was recorded. Medical records documenting the accidents I'd had over the years were subpoenaed. The police arrived at my parents' house at 2 that afternoon. I wasn't there to see it, but Eleanor Vance described the scene to me later with evident satisfaction. David had opened the door in his bathrobe, probably expecting carolers or a late delivery. Instead, he found 2 officers with a warrant for his arrest on charges of reckless exposure to danger and physical harm. Sarah tried to intervene, insisting there was a misunderstanding, but she was informed she was also being investigated for neglect. Chloe had been placed in emergency foster care pending the investigation. I felt terrible about that part until Grandma Vivian assured me she was already working to gain custody of both of us. The emergency placement lasted only 72 hours before a judge granted Grandma Vivian temporary guardianship, an unusually fast resolution her legal team had fought hard to achieve. The house, the one Grandma Vivian had looked at and said demolish, came next. It turned out David had been struggling financially for years. He'd taken out a second mortgage, then a third. He was behind on payments, barely keeping collectors at bay. When his arrest became public, the bank accelerated foreclosure. The house went to auction 4 months later, after the legal process had run its course. Grandma Vivian bought it for cash, paying slightly above market value just to ensure she won the bid. Then, she had it torn down. I watched from the passenger seat of her Mercedes as excavators reduced my childhood home to rubble. Every wall that had witnessed my humiliation, every corner where I'd hidden and cried, every inch of space that had contained my suffering, gone in a matter of hours. In its place, Grandma Vivian commissioned a small community park with a playground for local children. She named it Hope Garden. David's trial happened 4 months later. He tried to fight the charges, claiming I was a troubled teenager who'd exaggerated a minor disciplinary action. But Eleanor Vance had done her homework. She produced neighbors who'd heard him screaming at me for years. She brought in teachers who'd noticed bruises I tried to hide. She even found a former coworker who testified that David bragged about keeping his daughters in line with physical intimidation. The prosecution added my medical records as evidence, a broken wrist at 11 that I'd claimed came from falling off my bike, a concussion at 13 from walking into a door, countless bruises explained away as clumsiness. The pattern was damning. David was convicted of reckless exposure to danger and sentenced to 18 months in prison, plus 5 years of probation. Sarah, who had attended every day of the trial despite her own legal troubles, let out a sound like a wounded animal. I felt nothing at all, just a strange hollow sensation where relief should have been. I flourished in ways I hadn't thought possible. Free from the constant anxiety of living with David, my grades soared. I made friends for the first time, real friends who valued me for myself rather than tolerating me out of pity. I joined the debate team and discovered a talent for argumentation. My school counselor said it probably came from years of having to defend myself against unreasonable attacks. 3 years later, I graduated at the top of my class with a full scholarship to Princeton. The day I received my acceptance letter, Grandma Vivian took me to the site where our old house had stood. Hope Garden was full of children that afternoon, laughing and playing on the equipment she'd donated. She stood beside me, watching them, and said something I'll never forget: "When your father was a child, I gave him everything except consequences. I thought money and privilege would be enough. I thought love meant never making him uncomfortable. I was wrong, and you paid for my mistakes." She turned to look at me directly. "You deserved so much better than what you got. All I can do now is try to make the future worthy of the person you're becoming." I went to Princeton. I studied biochemistry and graduated summa cum laude. During my junior year, I started a research project on frostbite treatment that would eventually become my doctoral thesis. Something good, I thought, should come from the worst night of my life. College was another revelation. The campus sprawled across historic buildings and manicured lawns, a world away from everything I'd known. My freshman roommate, Olivia, from California, had never experienced temperatures below 4 degrees Celsius. She thought my obsession with layering and always carrying emergency supplies was hilarious until I explained why cold weather made me anxious. After that, she kept an extra blanket on her bed specifically for me. The biochemistry program challenged me in ways I desperately needed. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who valued intellectual rigor and curious inquiry. Professors pushed back on my ideas, not to humiliate me, but to strengthen my arguments. Classmates debated theories over coffee without any undertone of cruelty. The academic environment operated on principles I'd never encountered before. Disagreement could be productive, mistakes were learning opportunities, and success was measured by growth, not perfection. My research into frostbite treatment began almost accidentally. During a seminar on tissue regeneration, my professor mentioned that cold-related injuries remain surprisingly difficult to treat despite advances in emergency medicine. Something clicked. I stayed after class to ask questions, then spent the next 6 months devouring every study I could find on the subject. The human body's response to extreme cold fascinated me. Maybe it was because I understood viscerally what those medical papers described clinically: the vasoconstriction that cuts blood flow to extremities, the formation of ice crystals in tissue, the paradoxical sensation of warmth that signals severe hypothermia. I had lived through it, and now I wanted to understand it well enough to help others survive it too. My doctoral thesis proposed a new approach to frostbite treatment involving targeted warming protocols and anti-inflammatory interventions. The work took 5 years and countless setbacks, but by the time I defended my dissertation, 3 hospitals had already expressed interest in clinical trials based on my research. Grandma Vivian flew in for my defense, sitting in the front row with Chloe, both beaming with pride as I fielded questions. "Dr. Henderson always said you'd do something remarkable," Grandma Vivian told me at the celebration dinner afterward. She said she'd never seen anyone transform trauma into purpose so completely. I hadn't known Grandma Vivian had stayed in touch with my childhood therapist. Learning that she'd followed my progress behind the scenes, never interfering, but always caring, made me cry into my champagne. The grandmother who had arrived in a black limousine to save me had never stopped watching over me, even when I didn't realize she was there. Chloe, meanwhile, had found her passion in advocacy. She finished high school a year early and went to law school with the express purpose of becoming an attorney for children's welfare. The girl who had once blamed me for breaking up our family now dedicated her life to helping other children escape similar situations. Her transformation had begun during David's trial. Watching the legal system work, imperfectly, slowly, but ultimately in service of justice, awakened something in Chloe that soccer and therapy hadn't been able to reach. She started volunteering at a legal aid clinic during her senior year of high school, absorbing everything about how the system operated. "I want to be the person who helps kids when no one else will," she told me the night before she left for law school. "I want to be the Eleanor Vance for someone who doesn't have a billionaire grandmother to hire her." Law school suited Chloe far better than I would have predicted. The girl who had spent years staying quiet and small discovered she had a gift for argumentation that rivaled my own. Her moot court performances became legendary. By her 3rd year, she had job offers from 3 prestigious family law firms. She turned them all down to work for the public defender's office, specifically in the juvenile division. The salary was a fraction of what she could have earned elsewhere, but the work meant everything to her. Every child she helped, every perpetrator of harm she helped prosecute, every family she helped rebuild, each case was a small redemption for the years she'd spent unable to protect herself or me. We grew closer as adults than we'd ever been as children. The trauma that had initially separated us became the foundation of an unbreakable bond. Chloe understood things about me that I never had to explain, and I could read her moods with an accuracy that startled her partners and friends. We talked on the phone at least twice a week, sometimes for hours, processing old memories and celebrating new victories. David got out of prison after serving 14 months. Grandma Vivian's investigators kept tabs on him, so I knew he'd moved to a small town in another state where nobody knew his history. He worked at a warehouse. He rented a studio apartment. He had no contact with Sarah, who had divorced him while he was incarcerated and remarried a man she'd met at her mandatory parenting classes. Neither Chloe nor I had spoken to either of them since that Christmas Eve. I often wondered what David thought about during his time in prison. Whether he felt remorse or only resentment, whether he understood the magnitude of what he'd done, or still believed himself the victim of an ungrateful daughter's lies. The investigators' reports were clinical and factual: employment records, rental agreements, utility bills, offering no insight into his internal state. Sarah remarried faster than anyone expected. Her new husband, a mild-mannered accountant named Mark, seemed like the opposite of David in every way. They moved to a suburb 3 states away and built a quiet life that apparently included no mention of the daughters Sarah had abandoned. She never reached out. No letters, no calls, no attempts at reconciliation. The woman who had watched me freeze in the snow simply erased Chloe and me from her existence, as if we had never been her children at all. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. Grandma Vivian's love filled the maternal void in many ways, but a hollow space remained inside me, shaped exactly like the mother I should have had. In therapy, I worked through the anger and grief in cycles that seemed endless. Dr. Henderson helped me understand that Sarah's abandonment said everything about her limitations and nothing about my worth, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are very different things. The dramatic confrontation I'd always expected with David never happened. He simply faded away, becoming smaller and less significant with each passing year. By the time I finished my doctorate, he was barely a footnote in my life story. The power he'd once held over me had evaporated like morning frost. Grandma Vivian passed away peacefully in her sleep when I was 32. She left the bulk of her fortune to various charitable foundations, but Chloe and I each received enough to never worry about money again. More valuable than the inheritance was the letter she left me, handwritten in her elegant script. Her funeral was a grand affair she had planned herself down to the smallest detail. Hundreds of people filled the cathedral, business associates, employees, philanthropists, artists she had supported, and ordinary people whose lives she had touched in ways large and small. Chloe and I sat in the front pew, clutching each other's hands, trying to reconcile our private grief with the public mourning happening all around us. The eulogy I delivered was the hardest speech of my life. I talked about the grandmother who had appeared out of the darkness on the worst night of my existence. I described how she had wrapped me in her fur coat and driven me toward a future I couldn't have imagined. I shared the lesson she had taught us about resilience, generosity, and the transformative power of unconditional love. My voice broke 3 times, but I finished. She would have expected nothing less. After the service, person after person approached Chloe and me to share their own Grandma Vivian stories, a woman whose small business had been saved by an anonymous loan that she later learned came from our grandmother, a young man whose college education had been funded through a scholarship program Grandma Vivian had established decades earlier, a middle-aged artist who had been given his first gallery show because our grandmother believed in his work when no one else would. Each story added another facet to our understanding of the woman who had raised us. The reading of the will took place in Grandma Vivian's study, surrounded by the books and artwork she had loved. Her attorney, a dignified man named Arthur, who had worked with her for 40 years, distributed bequests with solemn efficiency. The bulk of the estate, billions of dollars, went to the charitable foundation that would bear her name. Preston Wright Industries would continue operating under the leadership of executives she had personally chosen and trained. The penthouse apartment, the vacation homes, the art collection, all designated for specific purposes that aligned with her values. Chloe and I each received our inheritances and trusts structured to provide lifetime income while preserving the principal for future generations. The money was substantial, ensuring financial security. But it was the personal items Grandma Vivian left us that meant the most. I received her writing desk, where she had penned decades of correspondence and business plans. Chloe got her collection of first-edition books, curated over 60 years of passionate reading. Small tokens that contained enormous meaning. "You taught me," she wrote, "that strength isn't about never being broken. It's about getting up every time life knocks you down." That Christmas Eve, I found a girl who should have been destroyed by her circumstances. Instead, I found someone who had learned to survive against impossible odds. I didn't save you that night. You had already saved yourself. All I did was give you the resources to become who you were always meant to be. Use them well. Make the world better than you found it. And never, ever let anyone make you feel small. I've tried to honor her words every day since. My research on frostbite treatment has helped save lives in emergency situations around the world. Chloe has personally handled over 300 children's welfare cases, removing children from dangerous homes and placing them with people who will love them properly. We both serve on the board of the foundation Grandma Vivian established to support survivors of childhood mistreatment. The woman who stepped out of that limousine on the worst night of my life gave me something more valuable than her billions. She gave me the radical, transformative belief that I deserve to be treated with dignity. She showed me what family could look like when it wasn't poisoned by cruelty and control. She proved that it was never too late to change the trajectory of a damaged life. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that Christmas Eve. The cold that seeped into my bones. The window where I watched my family celebrate without me. The moment my mother looked at me, shivering in the snow, and chose to close the curtains. What she didn't understand, what none of them could have predicted, was that she wasn't closing me out. She was closing herself in. In that dark, frigid moment, I was actually on the threshold of everything. A car was coming down the street that would carry me toward a future brighter than anything I could have imagined. The house is gone now, replaced by a garden where children play and laugh. David exists somewhere out there, diminished and forgotten. Sarah moved on with her new husband and never looked back. The only things that remain from that night are the small scars on two of my toes where the frostbite touched deepest, and the memory of a single word spoken by a grandmother who refused to let injustice stand: demolish. Not just the house. The entire structure of harm, silence, and complicity. She tore it all down and helped me build something new in its place. Something strong, beautiful, and free. If you're watching this, and you're in a situation like I was, please know that it can get better. It might not be a billionaire grandmother who shows up to rescue you, but there are people out there who will help if you reach out. Teachers, counselors, hotlines, anyone who will listen and believe you. You deserve safety. You deserve love. You deserve a future where you're not defined by the cruelty of people who should have protected you. Your story isn't over. Mine almost was, on a frozen Christmas Eve when I was 15 years old. But the next chapter was waiting just around the corner, in a black limousine with a fierce old woman who looked at my suffering and decided to end it. What would you have done if you saw that limousine pull up?